Hey, hey, it's Jeff. Now, a lot of you mentioned in your reflections for Project 2 that what you have found particularly useful, maybe not just for that project, but in general, is looking at examples of other people executing the same project you've been assigned to do in class, right? So the kind of previous student examples, the example essays from your text, and so forth. So I thought maybe we'd have a couple of screencasts where we look at the two examples that are provided in the two different textbooks we're working with for writing proposals. So in this one, we'll take a look at the one from A Little Argument, and I already mentioned in the last screencast, this was the one on amending the Constitution to allow non-Native Americans to run for president. Then we'll look at the kind of op-ed example that's in Scenes of Writing in a screencast that will probably be released tomorrow morning. All right, so let's scroll on down on our schedule page. You'll see notes here on Sample Proposal Review. Let's make it a real melting pot. And again, all you gotta do is drag yourself on over to our Blackboard site, and in the content folder for our site, you'll find PDF of this chapter. So again, right underneath the kind of point breakdown of how to make a proposal argument, we have this sample essay. Let's make it a real melting pot with presidential hopes for all. So again, as it's already been alluded to, this is an argument that's more or less, arguing that we make a change to the Constitution. And it's one that maybe is a useful one for us to think about insofar as it allows us to talk about how we might choose whether our proposal is what we're going to call a priority problem proposal or a priority solution proposal. And then maybe look at some of the more interesting rhetorical features of the essay and just kind of look like a paragraph breakdown of it to see how it carries forth its argument given its objective and given its priority as a proposal. So let's take a look here. What I did here is kind of first talk about this difference between priorities. So as mentioned in the previous screencast, maybe you're dealing with a problem everyone's aware of. So the example I used in the last screencast is a lot of people think parking is a problem for students at Wayne State. So you don't really necessarily have to convince your audience that's a problem. The real challenge of writing that as a proposal topic is coming up with a solution that's feasible, that's fair to all involved, that's convincing, and so forth. Now, the opposite of that would be a proposal where the solution might be really simple, but convincing people the problem exists is the challenge of it. And we have that situation being taken on by the student in this sample essay. So as mentioned here, it's what we might call a priority problem proposal, right? The solution is really simple. So we make a change to the U.S. Constitution. Not that it's necessarily easy to do that or to convince people to do that, but the solution itself is very easily described or easily articulated to someone else, right? So the real problem here is not so much what is the solution, but convincing enough people to make the change, right? So therefore the authors, they're prioritizing the problem here. So they emphasize positive consequences that will occur that make the U.S. a true democracy, and the negative consequences that are currently in place that or that will stay in place if we don't make this change, what they refer to as keeping naturalized Americans second-class citizens. So when I think about what's the thesis of this proposal, again, it's pretty straightforward. So it's take a stand against the discriminatory practice applied to foreign-born American citizens by this obsolete provision of the Constitution. So it's a straightforward thesis, but they kind of use some weighted language there, their use of adjectives in particular. So it's a discriminatory practice. It's an obsolete provision, so they've kind of weighted the terms already in the thesis. And they're using something like, we must take a stand. You can see how that's effective both by, we've talked about this before, of using the we to suggest that the audience and you are aligned on the same issue. And taking a stand, sounds like something you might want to do, right? Who doesn't want to take a stand? And that language is a little more stronger or affirmative than just saying we should change things, right? Taking a stand is maybe a little more inspiring language. So let's look at it kind of on a paragraph by paragraph basis. Now keep in mind, this follows what I take would be a standard format for proposal arguments like this. So we introduce or acknowledge a problem, right? We identify a solution. We argue the solution is feasible. And there's some kind of call to action. We emphasize the positive consequences, or what might just be a reduction of negative consequences, that the solution you're proposing is accepted by that audience. So if you take that four-part structure and apply it to the problem you're working on, you'll have a nice kind of little outline, or as you might have alluded from the image up at the top of this page, a blueprint for how to write your own proposal argument. So let's take a look at it in reference to the sample essay. So we have more or less half the essay, or more than half the essay, insofar as it's only a 7-paragraph essay, kind of introducing the problem. Just a couple of other, or some other work is achieved there. But it's not until paragraph 5 that we get the thesis. So what do we get before that? Well, we get kind of an interesting thought experiment by way of an introduction. So what the author suggests here is it puts you in a position where you're supposed to imagine there's an infertile couple that adopts a child from another country. The author gives the child the name Stu, and that this child is, for as much as it can remember, it's always lived in America. It's the only difference between it and an American-born citizen is that it wasn't actually born in America, but it spent its entire he has spent his entire life here. And at some point he realizes, when he's in civics class or history class, that he can never run for president just because he happened to have been born in a different country. So why is that an interesting introduction? Why does the author not just begin with, kind of a critique of the provision? Why do they begin with a thought experiment instead? Well, I think you know why, because we've talked about this kind of strategy before. It gets the audience to kind of empathize and identify with the situation, here being the person who's victimized or being discriminated against. We think of them as a baby first, being adopted, so they're kind of a very sympathetic character being created by this author. So that's an interesting way to kind of get the audience already on your side before you address the issue head on. Now after that, there's a couple paragraphs here on how the problem began, right? So the Constitutional Convention, there's all these debates about different things. There's a lot of worry about sedition and some other kind of loyalty to the new country and so forth. So by going back through the history of the Constitutional Convention and how this provision came about, that's useful to the author because they both emphasize how old this law is, right? So if it's really old, that might get the reader to start thinking about how, if it's really old, is it still applied to today's times? And that's kind of what the author is very explicitly arguing here. It was an old rule that made a lot of sense a very long time ago, but it doesn't really make sense now. And then by the time we get to the fourth paragraph here, they take up what was, at least at the time the author was writing, a pretty recent controversy. That Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's now, I think, been a little disgraced, I don't think we'll see him running for president, but at the time was a very popular governor, and it got people thinking that this is an individual that could run for president if not for this odd provision. And the mention here to amend for Arnold was a reference to a certain movement of at least some people who were fans of Schwarzenegger as a politician, arguing that we should make this amendment to the Constitution so it would make it possible, at least, for him to be a presidential candidate. So we have a lot of kind of run-up there, but I think you can see the work that's done by each of those paragraphs, even though we haven't necessarily gotten the thesis out in the front. And again, why does it make sense that the thesis might be delayed this far? Is because, again, it's not going to be, it's a priority problem approach here. It's not a priority solution one. So by the fifth paragraph, we do get the thesis, and here's what it is. Again, we're talking about you must take a stand, get rid of this obsolete provision, and then for the present time is ideal for change. So again, if you're arguing for a priority problem proposal when the solution is very easy, people might wonder, well, why haven't we had this solution before, right? The solution's an obvious one. Why haven't people already taken care of it? Why were they waiting for you to propose it or to convince people that it was done well? Well, that might be because no one's realized the problem until now. That's why you have to prioritize the problem. But also be that conditions have changed, so now it makes particular sense to try to do this. So that's, again, why the author brings up the Amend for Arnold movement, and that's why they use language like this, at the present time, the present time is ideal for change. And then what do we have in the paragraph 6 and paragraph 7? Positive consequences of accepting the proposal. So they use language like it'll mend the national image of the U.S., it'll fulfill the long-time promises of the nation. Now again, those are all things that we would presume most Americans would care about. Again, it's at the time the author was writing, and I think a lot of this would still apply today, the U.S. had kind of had a lower, or there was a more unfavorable opinion towards the United States than in, say, the previous decade due to the war in Iraq and other reasons. So it'll mend this national image problem that we have and fulfill the long-time promises of the nation. So that's also, we presume, appealing because the use of the promise of the nation, we're fulfilling something. All of that, again, is very kind of affirmative language. It kind of carries a certain rhetorical effect to it that you wouldn't get if you just said, we should make this change because things are unfair, right? And then what do we get in the last paragraph? Again, what you would expect to see at the end of a proposal, kind of a reaffirmation of the importance of the problem and its solution, and then encouraging that audience to take some kind of action. So here again, since the author's strategy was to convince a large number of people who would hopefully come across this essay to take what we might call grassroots action here, right? So instead of convincing particular, let's say a person in Congress to propose this legislation, instead speak to people directly, citizens, and encourage them to write to their representatives and to support this kind of legislation. So again, I hope kind of diagramming or breaking down the essay in this way is useful insofar as it thinks of maybe how you might create your own blueprint, your own paragraph by paragraph outline for what you want to do in your proposal, but also for thinking about how what this author does here, is the way you might also be writing something that makes an appeal for grassroots action, or you might not. But it helps emphasize kind of the difference between those things and the kind of choices you're going to have to make when you're planning your proposal essay. So I'll be back soon with more screencasts. Again, this sample essay, if you haven't already read it, take a look at it. It starts here on page 119 in chapter 4 of A Little Argument. It runs, as I mentioned, for 7 paragraphs there. So if you haven't taken a look at it, take a look at it, and go back through the little outline I made here and see how that fits up and how you might perhaps use a similar structure in writing your proposal argument. In the meantime, again, as always, you have any questions, any concerns, send me a text, give me a call, or make an appointment. I hope too many of you weren't inconvenienced by me canceling office hours this morning. And again, I'm happy to meet with you anytime I'm free. Just drop me an email. All right, until later.